Thank you very much for that introduction. And we're going to start pretty much straight off. We want to try and maybe tighten up the session a little bit. But the point about what we're going to do is to try and engage you as an audience with our thought processes. So, as you are aware, we have a theme across the festival which indicates the connection between heritage and literature. Now, all of us are architects, and clearly for most people, and for particularly in the context of this current new understanding of Ahmedabad as a heritage city, the focus is on architecture. So what we're interested in looking at is going beyond architecture, perhaps starting from that point of view. That's our enabling discipline, and then actually seeing where that leads us and how the city becomes for everyone an opportunity. So heritage is not just the physical reality of some beautiful structure in the old city, but actually it's something that we all belong to. So as you've already been introduced, each of our panelists has a very different experience with a background in architecture. And what I'm going to ask each of them to do is to present, if you like, a statement of their own position, and then that will lead to a discussion and then an engagement with you. So I'm going to start with Riaz Bhai, if you'd like to come as well. And in addition to his being an architect, he's responsible for the latest new guidebook on Ahmedabad. So if I may bring him to the stand.
Thank you, Arthur. I'm not sure where to start on this because, but I'll share with you an imagination of the city as I see it that's come to me at the end of writing this book, which is really simply a guidebook that you would find for most cities in Europe and America for Indian cities. The guidebook actually looks at the question of architectural value and which are the buildings that one should visit in a city like Ahmedabad. Ahmedabad is a very interesting city, and it has many dimensions to it, and it's always been curious to me that a city which might have been about 2.5 lakh in population at the time of independence could garner so much architectural and other artistic interest over its recent history. So there's the physical dimension of the work itself, of the buildings that you might see, but also all the kind of people that were attracted to this place that we call Ahmedabad. And I think that we often forget that there are that these phenomena did take place. I mean, we are the first Indian city to be given the UNESCO World Heritage, but it's not the only first that Ahmedabad has had. So in my understanding of the city, there's this question as to how come it was Ahmedabad that had the first cooperative housing society, or how come it was Ahmedabad that had amongst the first municipalities or the first public transport systems that were under this municipality. How come it was this tiny little town in the western part of India that drew the incredible modern artists like Alexander Calder, or the engineer like Buckminster Fuller, or Charles and Ray Eames, let alone Corbusier and Louis Kahn, who are better known. So there's this tiny place which is largely got to do more with its people than with how it's made. That seems to constantly change the way that it's made, it grows, and it kind of develops. And if I looked at the most recent phenomenon, which is the World Heritage status, it's simply that Ahmedabad got it done. I mean, very few people would argue that Delhi perhaps is a living city with a much larger or much older heritage than Ahmedabad. But it's simply that the people get it done. And this is a dimension of Ahmedabad that's not only architectural, but it's also the way its processes work, the way the culture of the city is, etc. So my understanding from writing this book is both the physical dimension of the city, which is beautiful buildings, but also this intangible dimension of it. And there's a middle ground that a lot of our architectural studies have led to, and that's that when you actually visit and experience Indian cities, it's not really the buildings that you experience. You can take the old city as well. If you're walking into Dhalgarwad or the vegetable market, it's really the inhabitation of the city that is so vital. it's the market spaces, it's the way that people occupy the space that makes it extremely vivacious. And these are the places that we tend to enjoy. Even whether you talk about the Law Garden, or you talk about the happening places of now the western part of Ahmedabad, it's really these kind of places that draw us in, that allow us to imagine the way that we will use the city. I'm not talking about the imageability of the city, like, let's say, the riverfront, or the kind of pictures that are being posted in terms of gift city. This is another type of imageability, but I'm talking about the day-to-day, everyday engagement that we might have with cities. And in this, it's very interesting because it opens up this question of heritage that Arthur is talking about. We tend to separate heritage as that which is beautiful and special and valuable, as separate from that which we use every day, which seems to be somehow taken for granted. And I think that this is where I was having a discussion before this session, that how do we look at things which are ordinary? Because most really good cities are made up of ordinary things which are well made. And when I say well made, I don't mean that they're exquisitely detailed in the way that an architect thinks about it, but it is appropriate for its purpose. And I think this is the sense that I'd like to open up, maybe a dimension that I'd like to kind of bring, that what are the ordinary spaces of our cities that we value? And how do we use these on a day-to-day basis? And what is the imagination that we have of them? I find that more and more we tend to, the more specialized our thinking is about heritage, the more we tend to segregate our cities into beautiful and ordinary, special, and I don't know. I mean just we tend to cut it up into different categories. And then in order to engage with particular categories of that city, like say heritage, we need specialists and so on and so forth. And slowly those parts of the city get distant from the inhabitants of the city itself. And therefore they become less and less part of our urban imagination and the way that we use our cities, rather than being incorporated. In some sense, we make our cities more and more into museums. And I fear that somehow that is the way that Ahmedabad may also go, if we are not careful about how the heritage status is looked at. Thank you.
So thanks, Riaz. And as I said, what our role is within the panel here is to generate different responses to this theme and see how we can engage with each other as a way of generating a discussion, and then invite you in as well. So it's very much about seeing how you can respond to this idea of what your city means to you. So can I ask Pradeep to come and talk?
Thank you. As Arthur said, I've been trained as an architect. I studied here at CEPT University, but then later went on to study art and try and work as an artist and as a writer. So I think compared to Riaz and Manisha and Arthur, my approach is much looser. I've kind of pursued ideas and projects that interest me in terms of questions that help me clarify an aspect of thinking. So bear with me. What I'm going to do is just talk very quickly about 3 artistic projects that I pursued over the last few years. And one of the triggers for some of these projects is actually writing. And I find that writing and visual art are related in a very kind of profound way. So one small project that I worked on was based on a town called Wai, which is near Pune in Maharashtra. And while I was studying at CEPT, I had come across an essay written by 2 Americans who were traveling in India, William Worcester and Catherine Bauer Worcester. And I'll read you a couple of sentences of what they said. They encountered this town, Wai, and they said that here was an entire rocky riverbed which has been cut into long rows of noble steps with numerous temples and shrines placed in orderly relation to the steps. This does not mean that they are parallel or placed in any mechanical way. Rather, their great rhythm of steps, recognizing the natural curve of the banks, with the structures placed at different levels and angles, all with a real knowledge and the feeling of inevitability that makes one recognize a great creation. So I point to that as a project that I went and photographed many years later and found that these steps were, and the riverbank was in disrepair. This is on the Krishna River. But yet I was interested in these architects noticing something that had been built over 400 years without an architect, without a client per se. It was done much more organically. And these people noticed this beautiful riverbed without it being recorded by historians or archaeologists or ethnographers or others. So I'm interested in that kind of a thing, like how is a heritage that has not already been identified and pedigreed or sorted out, it is probably our role to actually stay alert and to identify and locate sites that may speak a little bit to what Riaz was saying about ordinary things that we take for granted, use every day, and are exceptionally beautiful as well. A second project that I'll also mention coming out of Ahmedabad, as a student here at CEPT, we had a related study where we had drawn a 12th century temple in Trichur called Vadakanathan. And I had a chance to revisit it again 20 plus years later. And I was interested again in seeing that the original study of that temple with very detailed measure drawings did not give me a way in, but yet when I was there photographing and studying it in person, I was able to actually see the beauty and the power of that design. And I felt like, here's a little text that I'd written where I just said that the essential form of the stone plinths, faceted columns and shades of nut brown and kumkum red, the clarity of the grid-like enclosure of the temple complex, and the deceivingly loose placement of the shrines modulating the flow gently, nudging, not forcing, and the modest grace of the devotees circling the temple and offering prayers. So, again, for us, a heritage site is something that allows us to suddenly notice in something that we may take for granted or don't have the ability to really see clearly, to find something that I was thinking was as complex and layered as Le Corbusier's Chandigarh project. So it is part of our tradition, and we have to kind of use the heritage sites probably to find a way to read and understand our own culture and our own architecture. The last project I'll quickly mention is one I did very recently in the last year, was a building designed by Charles Correa in Bhopal called Bharat Bhavan. And it was a unique experiment where Swaminathan, who was an artist and a founder, was able to place tribal art, folk art, and contemporary art on equivalent terms. And I was interested in that as an experiment. And again, I found that I understood the architecture through that collaboration between thinking of contemporary in a much more elastic way. So the space itself, as Correa described it, was large areas of open space surrounded by just enough built form to make one feel inside a piece of architecture. So I was thinking later then, does that kind of a project allow it to be more welcoming to all manner of people, including the tribal and the folk artists, to make it their own? So what is the relationship between contemporary, the present, and the present outside of metro areas? And finally, I'll just stop by saying that I work with photography, and I'm also interested in heritage sites that aren't immediately understood through visual terms. I feel that all of us now are using multiple media formats, encounter so much of the world on our computer screens and our phones. And I wondered what happens, because in each of these three examples, I encountered them initially either by text, book, or images, but found that the experience of visiting them and spending time there allowed for a slight opening up or a slight understanding that is not possible, that is not in text or not in images. So I'm interested in how we encourage that aspect of engagement with heritage sites. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep, for that very vivid expression of seeing the world around us, of seeing architecture and experiencing architecture. And again, people here might have their own reference to architecture on their own terms. Now, may we also invite Manisha to present her thoughts to us, please? Thank you very much.
Since we are short of time, I'll just read out this, what I have written. I'm taking the freedom today. I'm taking the freedom today to talk of some aspects of heritage other than architecture. I start with an interesting example of what can be the limits of heritage. We take paper. Recently, I met internationally known paper artist who talked of how roots and plants are of different color in different parts of the world because of the soils, climate, and water of that area. The handmade paper that is made anywhere in the world has a texture, color that is peculiar to that country. To this extent, how heritage is linked to the soil and vegetation of that country. The understanding of heritage is a continuous process. Go deeper into Indian or any other culture, and one realizes how color, texture, and patterns all weave together to form a total environment which is heritage of that place. Heritage is inheritance, heritage is everything that has value. Heritage normally refers to past. We value our past and heritage. Heritage is human expression which we need to preserve. Today, our awareness of heritage of built form is increasing by the day. We need to view heritage as a whole. The living traditions are equally important and should coexist with the built physical heritage. The idea would be when both find balance in our city of Ahmedabad. Heritage is not only architectural but also exists in our mind, literature, habits, be it food or clothing, daily routine and action. Let us recollect traditional city activities. Going to temple, akhadas, yogashram, vaids, street lariwalas, cloth vendors, pastiwalas, utensil sellers, Sunday market, Mithai Gully, Kinkhab Gully, Glass Gully, Paper Gully, Brass and Kansa Gully, Spice Gully, Vegetable and Grain Gully all add flavor and color to our city activities. These are some extraordinary heritage experiences of our city. With the pressure of modern life, we tend to become blind to these simple aspects of our heritage around us. Question that I have and want to ask, can we talk about global issue and relate them to heritage? Can we talk about kind of heritage we are going to leave behind for our future generation? Since this forum is for youth, the most critical problem as seen by the eyes of those aged between 18 and 35 are unemployment, food and water security, climate change, environmental pollution, poverty, health, corruption, and religious conflict. According to UNDP report, 40% of people in Gujarat are slum dwellers, agricultural laborers, daily wage earners. They are poor without basic hygiene, housing, education, and health. What does heritage mean to them? Can we make sense while talking about heritage and the above issues? Let's talk about two pillars of heritage, culture and climate. The roots of the above mentioned problems surface when there is an imbalance seen in these two pillars. Culture and climate shape our basic need of survival, roti, kapda, makan. If we consider culture as a pillar, then communities, festivals, be it dance, music, drama, literature, religious faith, food, and clothing, all decide our heritage. If we consider climate as a pillar, then also the choices of food, choice of clothing, choice of shelter are the result of climate. Animals, birds, humans, as well as plants and vegetation, all rooted in the environment and form part of the heritage of the location. The reason we are shifting away from our heritage, from our inherited food, shelter, and clothing heritage is perhaps because of the technology. TV, internet, and easy travel have mingled traditions. The serious question thus arises for younger generation: how to be rooted to our heritage, living as we are in climate and culture that is Indian. How can we talk about simple things which are and were there in our families as a result of passed on traditions since generations? Is it possible to keep the joint family going in our society when education sends youth all over the world? Is it possible to hold on to heritage through formal education at school level? We are a country where perhaps 70 to 80% of people still live in a joint family, sharing what we have and caring for others, and the family is part of our tradition and thus our heritage. Briefly, I want to touch upon heritage that is represented in food and clothing, since shelter is spoken about. It has been found that the things missed the most fondly are the flavors of home. A cooking recipe is a piece of our heritage. As significant as countries' monuments and artifacts, it deserves to be preserved for the same sense of urgency. Don't let globalization kill our diversity. Food is, food is rooted to a place, and it is food that roots us. It gives us sense of belonging. Like paper, food production is peculiar to the region, and only because of its land, soil, and air and water. An appeal to younger generation. Thanks to technology, we do have time at hand. Don't lose complicated and labor-intensive recipes of old times. We can also talk about sari in the same manner. But since time is short, I will skip the sari paragraph. The relevance of the sari in the Okay, I'll skip that. Value and cherish the heritage you inherit and create a heritage your children will be proud to take forward. I would like to conclude this talk with two questions. Can we somehow bring these living traditions around our built heritage to add human touch? And can we think about how we are going to leave behind beautiful balanced heritage for the coming generation? Thank you.
Thanking our three panelists. And what they've been able to do is to present very distinct and different understandings of what heritage is. And I think the last is Manishaben was quite more explicit about trying to engage very personally with you all about an understanding of what, in that sense, are we leaving behind, or what are we actually creating the possibility for going forward? Because heritage is not something about the past, but it's something that we carry with us. So what we are doing today, in time, will become heritage. So we may appreciate and love the enshrined, as it were, icons of heritage, but they, in their day, were absolutely modern. So the challenge for us as thinking, living, creating people is to place ourselves in this world such that in the future, what we've done becomes a part of this continual transformation. So thanks again. Now, if we could perhaps get any kind of feedback or comment from yourselves in terms of your own understanding of what it is that you're passionate about, what you're connected to with respect to how we describe heritage in different ways. So can I have anyone from the audience who wants to say something or generate a comment? Oh, please, the young man in the middle there. We have a microphone here.
That are sitting up over here. The modern architecture that we're talking about is a part of, a heritage. It's a modern heritage architecture. And if we talk about Navrangpura bus stand, which was designed by the stalwart Charles Correa, it is in a very shabby condition right now. If we talk about the Sanskar Kendra, which was designed by, again, a stalwart, it is in a very shabby condition from inside. So what are we doing for the modern architecture, which is a marvelous facade, I would say? At the same moment of time, we are preserving the walled city too. So how can we maintain the balance of maintaining the old architecture and the new architecture that is recently came up with in the 50s and 60s? Thank you.
It's an interesting question because I think Ahmedabad is presently as well known for its modern architecture. I don't know. There are lots of stories that Mr. Frank Gehry actually made a visit here by helicopter just to see the Milonas building and then flew back out. He didn't want to see anything else in Ahmedabad. So it to different people, the value of architecture in Ahmedabad is different. But one of the telltale signs of whether something is really heritage or not is the kind of stories that are associated with it. And I think this is a very important part. And partly the architectural community is to blame that the stories about modern architecture are largely amongst architects. So if I was to actually ask you why you think that the Charles Correa building bus stand is important and therefore has value, you will tell me it's designed by Charles Correa, which is an architectural kind of story that you're creating around it. But actually what happens there, what is the value of that building, we don't have a consensus on it. And only when we build stories around these buildings, to Bhadra, the old city, these have had enough time for there to be a kind of storytelling. You know that I went every Sunday, I used to go to buy mangoes in the old city. These are stories that you go through generation after generation. Do you know there's so much traffic in this area? I don't know how to get there, but the best fruit is only available in this part of the city. These are everyday stories that we weave and we make such that it becomes important to visit those places, buildings, etc. And a certain tradition of visiting them is carried on. Modern architecture is still very young, and that those stories haven't yet been woven around many of the buildings. You will find, for example, IIM has many stories, and therefore we agree more that it is a kind of heritage and it's worth keeping. Maybe SEPT and NID less, but we know that they are valuable buildings, etc., etc. They are landmarks for certain people. If you're going to university area, you will use these landmarks. Therefore, they don't have. I'm not talking about stories about them, but stories in which they play a part. And the more we use buildings of the modern type in the way that we navigate cities, the more they will become invaluable to us. And this is the thing that Navrangpura bus stand hasn't yet done that. And therefore, it's very difficult. You will artificially have to create its value in order to preserve it. That's the way I understand it. So I'm just putting it out there. Yes, so this would lead to a very interesting kind of discussion about heritage, because the first time I saw it as a student, it had ISTD. We don't have a ISD, STD, PCO, ISD, those old yellow shops anymore. But it used to have all these yellow banners on it, and it still was a bus stop, and it's still all those vertical concrete floating planes that Korea so evocatively borrowed from 1920s European architecture was still there, but they were hoardings. Now, which one would you consider to be the authentic Charles Correa building? The one with all the everyday hoardings on it, which I imagine was what he designed those planes for, or would you like it pristine, restored to its raw concrete, or would you like it now with its grey color and its kind of the fact that it's used? Which of these narratives are we going to take forward? And this is the problem, that when the minute you freeze something in time, you don't allow it to kind of take on many roles, and it'll have to over periods of time kind of settle into a particular narrative of its own. That's when we know that the Navrangpura bus stand is actually part of our common heritage. Right now, it's a heritage of.
And in speaking of narratives, he's only young, but when I first came to Ahmedabad, to actually use a telephone was a hugely troublesome affair. So it was far easier to go to what you call the bus stand, which I called the telegraph office, because upstairs was where you could send telegrams. So I might want to actually get in touch with my friend in Shaibag. It was easier to go to that building, send a telegram, the message would be sent to Shaibag, and we would communicate in that way. So narratives and meaning are changing all the time. So in the same way that if you look at one of the old buildings in the city, like Bhadra Gate or something like that, at one stage it might have been full of forts or cannons or whatever. So its function is no longer as a gateway, as part of a fortress. So how these are represented and reinterpreted. But just if I'm moving on to other people and their connection with their notion of being part of this city, being part of the continuum of what it is that heritage is about, which is a narrative. So has anyone else got anything else to say? Please. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, good afternoon. I'm actually an architect student, so I have a very architectural question for all of you guys. Like, we always think about, as architects, to look into the future. So now you have talked about how the Ahmedabad heritage has a very rich past. But how do we proceed from here? Like, how do we design or connect the old city, Ahmedabad, to the new Ahmedabad, because like 50 years or 100 years from now, that would be the heritage of Ahmedabad too. So I just wanted to ask you, how do we proceed? How do we look into the future?
That's the question I asked.
Like,
So on that, well, now on that happy note, because you're a young architect, we're going to give you that responsibility. So this is a challenge for you and for your colleagues. So tell your friends. Now, unfortunately, we would love to carry on the conversation, but there's a wonderful panel about to come to the stage who are actually also trying to catch a plane. So can we thank you for our session and invite the
Thank you very much. Buildings certainly interest us because of this emotional connect stories. It was a very interesting panel. I would ask Harshit to felicitate all of you with a memento, a gesture of our appreciation. Thank you very much. Harshit?